Okay, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name's Alistair Marsh. I'm a journalist with Bloomberg, and you're in the transition planning session. At least, if you wanted to go somewhere else, please do. Yeah. Anyway, this is going to be a great session covering transition planning, and rather than do a sort of long-winded introductions, I've asked each of the panel to basically say what their involvement is in this topic. How it touches the work that they do. So we have next to me Karen Ellis, who's Chief Economist at WWF UK, and we have Karine who's the Chief Governance and Compliance Officer at Norges Bank Investment Management, with a big focus on ESG, and then Mark Manning, who's Strategic Policy Advisor for Sustainable Finance ESG topics at the FCA. So if we could go in order, I'll ask you one at a time, just tell us, as an introduction, where does transition planning touch your work, i.e. why are you on this panel?
Great, well thank you very much and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So at WWF we are working to promote a net zero, nature positive economy and financial system, and so we were part of the campaign that was calling on the government to announce that it would be the first net zero aligned financial centre in the world, which it did at COP26, which we were super happy about. And so that process kicked off a Transition Plan Taskforce that the government established to define the gold standard for transition plans that were going to be required of companies and financial institutions from 2023 onwards, so this year. And so we were part of that task force from the word go. We've been very active within it. One particular focus of ours has been around how to incorporate nature into transition plans, because we believe that you cannot achieve net zero without tackling nature loss. It's around a third of the cause of climate change, of the emissions that are causing climate change. So we need to tackle that. And nature-based solutions can also be around a third of the solution that we need to get to net zero. So we really cannot think about achieving net zero without tackling nature loss. So we've been defining how nature considerations can be factored into climate transition plans, and we're chairing a working group looking at that. We're also co-chairing a working group in the task force looking at the food sector, specifically in developing food sector guidance. We're also thinking about the regulatory framework that you need around transition plans to ensure that that whole transition plan process does result in good outcomes, decarbonisation that we all seek, but also that wider economic transition. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more about those recommendations we're developing a bit later on in this session. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Karine.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I would say transition plans is sort of smack in the middle of my work, actually. So as you heard, I represent Norges, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, a large global investor, $1.5 trillion now. And we are very clear that it's climate risk, it's financial risk, and that we want the 9,000 companies we have invested in to reach net zero at the latest by 2050. So we have clear expectations to those companies we are invested in on target setting. But of course, one thing is setting targets. We can all do that. Another thing is how you actually reach those targets. And that's what the transition plan is all about. So what we're doing more and more is really engaging with the companies on what a good transition plan is, how they can report on it, and how, as an investor, we follow up on it. So as I start saying, this is very much in the heart of what we do as a responsible, but also as a financial investor.
Fantastic. Mark?
Thank you very much indeed. Great pleasure to be here this morning, and this is a topic that I certainly enjoy talking about. So, what does the FCA what does the FCA look for in this particular space? Why do we care? When we published our ESG strategy back in 2021, at the time of COP26, we recognised that finance can play quite a significant role in supporting a journey towards a positive and sustainable economy. And a critical part of that is a net zero economy. And that is going to be dependent upon both transparency and trust. And that's why we've been involved very, very centrally in the work that the Transition Plan Taskforce is doing, which Karen just introduced there. That is really all about developing a framework for credible transition plan disclosures, and we see that transparency around companies' forward-looking plans as being increasingly critical to capital allocation decisions across the financial services sector, and ultimately the delivery of the funding that is going to be required to drive fundamental transformational change across the real economy. So at the same time, it's very relevant to the trust pillar of what I was just referring to in our ESG strategy, because it is, as Karim was saying, the evidence base for the targets and commitments that are being made around net zero, and ultimately the discipline and the accountability around those commitments, thereby addressing some of the concerns around greenwashing and other sort of trust and credibility considerations. So ultimately, this is a central area of focus for us as we think about the role of finance in driving positive, sustainable change. Once we have transition plan disclosures in place, we certainly expect to see a vibrant ecosystem building around those that can drive forward the embedding of sustainability in finance more generally. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I very much like the remarks from Alex, who was hosting the prior panel, much more gregarious, in a much more gregarious way than I'm doing here. But he said that this today is about getting down to the nitty-gritty. And so getting down to the operationalization or the implementation of these kinds of things. So I'm sure that we have a pretty sophisticated audience here, many of whom may have developed transition plans or be in the knee-deep in that kind of work. But I thought, just to establish a baseline for what we're talking about, could you, any one of you who'd like to, tell us what is a transition plan, just briefly, just so we can get past this point. What is a transition plan and why is it important? I.e., what are we talking about here? Maybe you could just, one or two of you briefly say that, and then we'll move on.
Yep. Do you want to go? I'm always happy to. But
I think you said it very well when you talked yesterday. You said, you can set transition plan is really, you can make it, say, when you set net zero targets, that's like setting a target, like you want to run a marathon, whereas the transition plan is your training plan for getting there. And I think it's very well said. So I'm going to steal that when I talk about transition plan many times. There's a lot of discussions around what transition plans should contain. And I think it's quite difficult for many companies to really understand, what should we put in there? What do investors want? So we have actually now, we're going to come out with a new sort of climate expectations to the companies we have invested in. We're going to launch those in September. But one pillar, clear pillar of that is exactly what we expect from transition plans, what they should contain. And it's one page long, so it's not too much wording, but it gives some indications. I think for us as a financial investors, we like to see a lot of financial information in there. But I think if you can for us, boil it down to three things. It's really about the company's strategy. How is the company's business going to take the companies down to net zero? It's about financial planning, capital expenditure, abatement cost, how do you avoid carbon lock-in, etc., R&D expenditures. And then it's also about scenario planning. And I think at least with those three elements, you come quite far as a company in your transition plan. But you probably have much more to add, being sort of in the details of the work.
Thank you very much. So the way we've been thinking about it, both at the FCA and at the TPT, is to really start from the definition of a climate transition plan within the new ISSB disclosure standards. And they talk about a transition plan as being an aspect of an entity's overall strategy, including targets, activities, and resources that will help the entity navigate towards a lower carbon future. And I think there are a couple of aspects of that that are absolutely critical when we think about what a transition plan is and what it should therefore entail in terms of the information and content. First of all, that it is an aspect of an entity's overall strategy, so it's embedded within wider corporate strategy. This isn't a siloed activity that is just focused on climate and sits alongside the corporate strategy. It has to be integral to it. And that's especially relevant when you think about how the transition to a lower carbon future is going to require what I referred to before as a fundamental whole of economy transformation. This isn't incremental change. This is taking us into a probably very, very different economic paradigm. So that embedding within the corporate strategy is really, really critical. And then targets, actions, and resources, I think, speak to a lot of what Kareem was just talking to there. What is the target you're shooting at? What are the activities that are going to be required to get there? And what resources, both in terms of financial resources, human resources, and capital investment is going to be required to actually deliver on that plan. And I think in the TPT, we've sort of elaborated a little bit beyond that, that baseline ISSB definition to really articulate what we call a strategic and rounded approach to transition planning and transition plans. And that's an approach that looks beyond the entity's own decarbonisation to also think about, first of all, how it is responding to risks and opportunities as the world around it decarbonises, but fundamentally also thinking about the levers that it can pull within its business model, within its sphere of influence, to embed and accelerate the decarbonisation of others. And that's taking that whole of economy, broad-ranging perspective that is ultimately going to be required if we're going to shift an entire economy to a lower carbon and, of course, climate-resilient future. And I can elaborate on some of that as we go on through the discussion, if that would be of interest. Thank you.
Maybe just to add one point, I totally agree with everything both the panelists have said, but I would also add that it is really important that these transition plans help companies think through their own internal processes and embed it in decision-making, etc. But it's also a really important tool for the markets, for the regulators, for civil society, etc., to compare the performance of companies. And that is a big part of the theory of change, actually, that this will be used by the markets to judge how well a company is doing and make decisions accordingly. And so for that purpose, I think there's also, it's really important that there's some elements of that transition plan that are directly comparable and easily comparable so that they can quickly be judged and assessed. So the risk at the moment is that transition plans will be quite long, complex, creative, because this is a new, the beginning of a journey we're all on. But I think when we get onto this sort of regulatory question, which is part of the topic for today, to have a few key metrics perhaps that are standardized and that are reported somewhere centrally that can be quickly used to compare both the level of ambition of a company with its peers in that sector and also to judge how well it's performing in terms of delivering on the targets it's set itself. So I just wanted to add that point.
Brilliant. Well, there are lots of great things in there, Corinne. I'm keen to get back to your expectations in a moment and keen to talk about the TPT in more detail as well. But I've heard this year described, I've heard it by a couple of people, described as the year of the transition plan. GFANs have talked about that and various others. I wonder, is that, are we getting a bit ahead of ourselves? Because there's more expertise on this side of the table than on this side, but I've read some of the initial transition plans, a couple of them, and I wasn't exactly blown away with the level of detail. Some of it seemed a bit threadbare, may I be so bold. And I just wonder, do you think we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves? Is it really the year of the transition plan, or is it the year of talking about, thinking about, preparing for, moving towards, like, what's happening at this point? Give us a reality check.
Okay, yeah, I think you're right. It is the year of talking about transition plans, and as we're doing now. And luckily, some companies have come further than just talking about it. Some companies have started a bit, and as you say, probably not that impressive. Some companies have actually managed to get quite a good transition plan together, but it's still a long, long way to go. So if you look at the companies in our portfolio, 9,000 plus companies, at the end of the year, only around 20% of the companies have even had set targets for net zero 2050. And that's just the first step, if you think about it. So, we're not even close to companies have been taking, a large amount of companies have been taking up transition planning. I think Climate Action 100 Plus, they did a sort of benchmark of the large emitters, and I think they found that 13% of the large emitters of the companies had credible transition plans. So we're just starting. But talking about it is actually a good start. I mean, we have to start somewhere. And the more we talk about it, hopefully, the more companies speed up their transition planning.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, certainly we are at the start of the journey here. We, in addition to some of the evidence that Corinne's just spoken of, we had a study by CDP that was looking at, I think, something like 18,000 companies, and only 80 or thereabouts were deemed to have sort of ticked all the boxes, if you like, in terms of what constitutes a credible transition plan. And there was another study by EY that also showed that there were very significant gaps and shortcomings in what we have seen come through so far. But I think in many respects that's to be expected, given that we are only now coalescing around a view of what a credible transition plan looks like, what are its constituent parts, and that's very much the work that we're doing at TPT, and Corinne's just talked about expectations from the Norges Bank side of things. Ultimately, we needed to get that sort of structure and that common understanding before we can sort of truly deliver the credible transition plans that markets need and that we need companies themselves to be developing in order to drive their own forward strategies. So with that, with more guidance, with more structure, with more support, we can get the ecosystem building, and this is an essential part of the journey. So maybe it's not the year of the transition plan, it's the year of laying the foundations for transition plans and building that common understanding of what we need to see in that space.
Yeah, and if I may add something there, maybe that was much nicer said, the foundation for the transition plans, than saying we're just talking about it. And I think we have to understand, I mentioned the lack of companies having a transition plan, but it's not easy for companies. This is highly complex questions that companies have to deal with in their transition plans. The whole energy systems have to shift. It's how are the company going to deal with that? That it takes time to sort of get into the details of how to get to net zero 2050 is not strange. And I think the work now that Mark and others are doing in sort of laying the foundation, giving good guidance, supporting companies is hugely, hugely important.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to talk in a moment about all the different regulatory initiatives targeting transition planning, and we've also disclosed how there's some TPT experience here on the panel. But let's talk a little bit then about what are the constituents, what are the core ingredients of a good transition plan, and is there consensus forming around that at this point as all these various working groups develop their standards and so on? Karen, maybe I could start with you on that one.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, obviously that is a large part of what the Transition Plan Taskforce is doing, and there's work going on elsewhere in GFANS, for example, to define good practice around transition plans, and as has been alluded to. And I think that is urgently needed, and that is shaping now, so I think that's really positive. As Mark mentioned, I think the fact that it's got three components, decarbonisation, responding to climate risks, and contributing to the economy-wide transition, that's the TPT sort of three-pillar approach, is really important, because that third one in particular, contributing to the economy-wide transition, is where companies can think creatively about what they can do to, you know, change consumer preferences, or to engage with the government to develop policy frameworks that support that transition, which is also a really crucial part of delivering this. So that, I think, that framework is really helpful. WWF, have published its own criteria for a good transition plan, which sets out key elements. One of those is around the level of ambition and prioritisation, and it says as the first point really is commit to net zero in line with 1.5 degree warming. It's notable that's actually absent from the requirements from the Transition Plan Taskforce at the moment. There is no prescriptive benchmark or level of ambition that's required. All it's asking to do at the moment is for companies to publish transition plans setting out how they will achieve whatever targets they have set themselves, what they are doing to respond to the climate crisis. So it isn't actually saying companies must align with 1.5, which we think will need to happen, because we need to get there. We need companies all to be driving in that direction. And I don't think you can rely on the market to drive that. I think you will need regulatory policy approaches to drive that as well. So for us, that's a really key element, including nature in the transition plan and the just transition elements. That is coming out of the Transition Plan Taskforce as well. Obviously, it's key for WWF that nature and just transition are incorporated, and it's developing guidance around this that goes beyond just nature for net zero as well. For the Transition Plan Taskforce, we're focusing on nature to deliver net zero, but we think in due course there will be a move towards nature recovery plans as well, and ideally those would be integrated with climate transition plans. So that's a journey we're all on. There's also criteria around action implementation, accountability and verification, so governance structures and third-party verification of the information that's contained. A lot of thought needs to be put into that, I think, because we need some degree of verification and assurance, but I know we're moving into new areas around forward-looking planning and, you know, into a world we're not familiar with. So assurance might need to change a bit and update itself to sort of respond to this new reality that we're moving towards. And the final one is around feedback and flexibility. So just the recognition that everyone's on a journey, we have to start somewhere. We hope that these transition plans will get better and better over time, that markets will update themselves and understand what they're looking for as well, and that will drive up ambition over time as well. And we will need regulators to be monitoring and enforcing that implementation and publication of transition plans as well. So there's some of the key things, I think, from WWF's point.
Seems like quite an oversight that the 1.5 degree is not included.
It's kind
Personal
of alluded
opinion.
to in the terms of reference for the transition plan, but I wouldn't say it's explicitly mandated at all. But I'd be interested in others' points of view on that.
Yeah, happy to jump in on that one. So I think there's a distinction here between a disclosure framework and public policy around climate ambition. So the disclosure framework we've developed in a manner that can, first and foremost, hook into climate-related disclosures under TCFD today and under ISSB tomorrow. So taking a very, very integrated approach there. And that reflects a lot of what I was saying earlier about the importance of seeing transition planning as being part of corporate strategy, and climate strategy generally should be an integrated part of corporate strategy. So ISSB as a disclosure framework is similarly agnostic around ambition and is very much geared towards giving the markets the information they need in order to make informed decisions. So we are, in disclosure frameworks generally, very much relying on market discipline to play an important role, and for investors such as my colleague here to my left to sort of impose and enforce that discipline and hold companies to account and tell companies when they don't, if they don't think that they are being ambitious enough. In order to impose a 1.5 degree aligned transition plan, that would require public policy intervention. That would require government action to require not only disclosure of plans, but the setting of plans that are 1.5 degrees aligned. So I think there is an important distinction there between disclosure and the doing. But if I can, while I've got the floor, just sort of supplement a couple of the points that Karen was making. Karen referred to the fact that we've been looking to the transition planning guidance that the likes of GFANS have prepared here. And the Transition Plan Taskforce has very much sought to be aligned with and integrated with these other frameworks. I've already mentioned ISSB. GFANS is important as well in that regard because they've set 5 components for transition planning, which TPT has then taken into the disclosure framework. So we've got 5 elements: foundations, implementation, strategy, engagement strategy, metrics and targets, and governance, which very much align with those components of the GFANS framework. And then we've got a series of sort of more granular disclosure recommendations sitting under each of those 5 pillars, but all with an eye to being very, very clear on the ambition in that foundations component and how that translates to objectives and priorities, how that then flows into your implementation strategy, the actions that you're actually committing to, and the assumptions and dependencies that you're making around what needs to be done. Incorporated within that, your financial planning, how you're going to resource your transition plan, and what effects you believe it will have on your financial performance, your cash flow, your financial position. And then engagement strategy, super important. How you are influencing your value chain, how you are working with others in your industry, how you are advocating for change through your engagement with government, regulators, civil society, and the communities in which you operate. And that is super important in thinking about that whole of economy approach. If you can have as a critical part of your transition plan that engagement piece, where you really explore your role in the wider whole of economy transition, that is, and everybody does that, then we will lower the risk that all entities face in the future. And then Karen also alluded to the governance piece in the context of the WWF expectations. This is a really important aspect of the TPT framework because it really thinks about not only what financial resources you need and how your business is going to change, but also what you're going to need to do to create the right incentives across the entity, to bring in the right skills and capabilities, to embed a culture that is aligned with the strategic ambition in your transition plan, and to put the right governance and accountability frameworks in place to ensure delivery. So I think there is a bit of consensus building around those elements. We certainly got very good feedback through the consultation process that we ran latter part of last year and early this year. And we've been working very hard with the TPT leadership and secretariat to try to drive this thinking internationally so that this isn't just a UK thing. This is ultimately a framework that can be the basis for thinking in other jurisdictions as well. I'll stop there. Thank you.
And if I may pick up there, because you mentioned since it's ambition agnostic in a way, and that's more of a policy issue, I think. And you also mentioned that's where maybe the investors come in. So it's important to say transition plans is only one sort of ask of the expectations we have to the companies when it comes to climate. And we sort of have five clear asks we have, just to put it in a context. And sort of briefly, the first is that the companies start analyzing its emissions. Not all companies even know what their emissions are, so they have to start analyzing and disclose, scope 1, scope 2, material scope 3 emissions. So start with analyzing and disclosing. Then it's about setting the ambition, and what we want to see is that the ambition is net zero at the latest by 2050, as I said. Then we want to see short, medium-term targets, so we sort of know the trajectory. And then comes the transition plan, really, that's your training plan, where are your water stations, how much do you eat along the way, etc., to get to the goal. And finally is reporting, reporting against the plan. So sort of those 5 elements. So transition plans, of course, being key here, but not everything.
Can I ask you, so you said that, if I'm not misquoting you, didn't you say that 20% of the 9,000 companies, is that the right number, have set net zero targets?
Yes.
So how many have set interim and how many have set the 4th stage, which is the transition plan? Does it get smaller and smaller in increments as we go down?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so less and less. I don't have the exact numbers for that, but when we say a credible net zero target, that sort of includes, a bit of a plan on how to get there, but not a full transition plan.
Okay. And then I guess, like, as Karen said at the beginning, investors would be one constituency that would benefit, I guess, the most from transition plan, because there's a way of, I guess, assessing and comparing the kind of transition readiness and also ambition when it comes to decarbonization of varying companies within sectors and so on within the portfolio. So I guess I was keen to ask you, as our sort of investor representative on the panel, like what we've sort of described a little bit, or discussed a little bit, why transition plans are useful, and we've talked a little bit about regulators are doing so much, but investors can be another kind of force or driver pushing things forward. Can you talk a little bit about what Norges Bank is doing in terms of pushing investors, or pushing sort of portfolio companies on transition planning? Do you require that? Do you think that's appropriate for investors to sort of require that? I know that some banks are starting to think about, in terms of their lending relationships, well, we want to see that you have a plan, you have a target, and then also you have a credible plan to get there before we're willing to lend you money. Does that become more and more part of the conversation at Norges, and then perhaps others of you could talk about the wider investor space?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right for an investor to require that. And as you say, I think we will have huge benefits from standardized transition plans, so we can compare companies across industries, across time, across sectors. So really, it will benefit us a lot. And I think it starts, it will also be important for our active investment decisions, because the transition plans will sort of tell us, is the company going in the right direction? Do you think this company has a viable future in a low-carbon society? Is the business of the company going to be there in the longer term? So absolutely, great benefit to us. And then you ask, how can we also be part of pushing? We have a whole group of people in the fund that works with, engaging with companies to push them in the right direction. So we have, last year we had like 3,000 company meetings. I think almost 900 of those meetings, we discussed climate. We discussed with companies that don't even have targets. We discussed target setting. With companies that have targets but no plan, we discuss, transition plans. And if companies have a transition plan, we discuss what's the progress against the transition plan and try to push them in the right direction. We call it engage to change. And then you can say, well, do we Do an investor that owns maybe 2% of the company, can they influence? And we think we can, at least with some companies. We are a long-term investor, provider of capital. Yes, we do think we can, at least some companies. And we also use our voting very actively. And last year, last voting season and this voting season, we voted against boards that we really think don't, manage climate risks well. And of course, in the end, we can also choose to divest, although our starting point is really that we want to be an owner and shareholder and use our influence.
Can I ask them more specifically, would you require or ask all of the 9,000 companies to prepare a transition plan if they haven't already? Which sounds like most haven't. Because
yes, we don't require, since it's not, we can't really require, but we say we expect them to. As an investor, this is what we expect, and our expectations are directed at all the 9,000 companies we invest in. So absolutely, it goes to all companies we invest in.
okay, and can I ask? A question to the broad panel. One topic that, in fact, it was in the other room a moment ago, and that I'm thinking about and writing about a lot at Bloomberg is this topic of engagement. And does it work? Is it effective? Is there anything better? Is it the best that we have, etc.? I guess when it comes to a topic like transition planning, is it that this is the best investors can do, but we're really waiting for governments to step up or regulators to enforce this kind of thing? Or how do you think about this?
It would be wonderful if we get regulations on transition plans. That would sort of raise the bar for all companies, right? So it's great what's happening with TPT on the regulatory side, and so that would be the best time. But I think in the meantime, on a lot of these issues relating to climate where there's lack of policy, I do believe investors have a role, and I do believe investors can influence the market by being very clear on expectations and also using, putting the finances in the right places. So we actually take the information we get, or we use the information we have on how companies adapt to climate risk and use them in active investment decisions.
Anyone else?
Yeah, maybe if I could come in on that as well. I totally agree. Investors can do a huge amount, and they are already increasingly playing that role, some at least. I guess the problem with that is that not all of them are, and not all of them will do, probably, unless it becomes mandatory. And the problem then is that companies that are not the greenest can always find access finance somewhere if it's not a mandatory thing across the board. So ultimately, and as soon as possible, I think actually we do need regulation to make this mandatory for all and to set that actual bar. The government's already made a commitment to become net zero aligned financial centre. It's hard to imagine how we're going to get there without making that a mandatory requirement for the financial sector. Or indeed for regulators actually to implement that process and to hit that target. So that's the other important development we think is needed, that the regulators are given that mandate and take responsibility for driving that net zero alignment, both through monitoring and enforcing the implementation of transition plans, of course, and, what does that mean? How does that look? Actually making sure that companies are publishing these and that they are following them, but also incentivizing that process as well through regulatory approaches. Many tools exist, whether it's capital requirements or whatever, that are associated with different levels of ambition and hence the different levels that companies are managing those risks. That should surely be reflected in incentives that are going to affect the bottom line, the actual financials of that company. So we think that is an important next step as well. And you also need wider government policy and economic policy to incentivize that transition. You can't expect the financial sector to do this by itself when the economic fundamentals don't necessarily always support that transition, or at least don't drive it fast enough. And we all know that's not the case. Carbon pricing isn't fully there yet. There's lots of problems, market failures, which the government needs to overcome. They have set out a lot of policies already in the Net Zero Review, for example, but as we know, that's been found to be lacking and not yet on track with our stated legal goals. So there's a lot more for the government to do, both through regulation and through economic policy, to support and drive that transition in the financial sector, I think.
Yeah, I think there's... I don't want to paint this as being about government policy or investor action. I think there's complementarity between the two. And in fact, there's complementarity between the public policy settings, the regulatory framework, and what the private sector can do, both within the financial services sector and then across the economy more broadly. So there is a role for transition planning and transition plans and market scrutiny and investor influence, even in a world in which you've got all of the all of the settings in place that Karen was speaking of. At the end of the day, investors will always have differing views on the credibility of certain assumptions or how the operating environment for a company is going to evolve over time. So all of this information needs to be out there for investors to scrutinise and form judgments and make capital allocation decisions accordingly. And that would then be within the frame of regulatory settings that mandate transition plan disclosures and potentially a public policy expectation around the degree of ambition in those plans. So all of these are complementary elements of the investment ecosystem.
Brilliant. Well, that's a good segue to talk about regulators. Now, Mark, I wanted to ask you just briefly, you've told us a little bit about what you've been doing. Maybe there's a few extra details you could provide on what the FCA is doing and thinking on transition plans. But perhaps more broadly, we could talk about what are regulatory expectations here? And is this going to work out that it's just another ESG sustainability document that kind of gets published but no one reads? I mean, from what we've described, hopefully that won't be the case, but there's a risk perhaps.
Yeah, thank you. Let me start with the last part of your question, and then I'll sort of talk about how that then plays out in terms of our forward-looking programme of work at the regulator. So I think we've touched on a lot of this already on the panel, but ultimately there are several use cases here for transition plans. There's the investor use case, financially material forward-looking information that investors and other providers of capital can scrutinise and use as a basis for their decisions and to hold companies to account and discipline them. So that investor and capital allocation piece is one key use case. And that also can be used as a basis for prioritising stewardship engagement, as we've just sort of touched on here. Then there is the use of that information to support the design and delivery of financial instruments and products that ultimately will be used to support the transition. And here I think you can see a world in which sustainability labelled instruments draw on transition plans as a basis to set sustainability performance targets and KPIs. And you can see this information feeding into credit rating agencies' forward-looking views on creditworthiness. You can see it ultimately building an ecosystem that relies then that is able then to take advantage of better forward-looking information. A third use case is the use case around credibility of claims. So this is the sort of anti-greenwashing type use case. And then the final one is the internal processing of this information and the use of this information to ensure that you've got a whole of organisation orientation towards the stated climate ambition. So these are fundamental use cases, which hopefully, if you think about all four of those together, make it quite clear that this is not just another disclosure. This is something that can actually be quite impactful within the company, within the financial services sector, and across the economy at large. And you can see governments processing this information. It can start to influence, the next NDCs and ultimately drive drive climate policy more on a more informed basis at the government level as well. So you've got all of these use cases there, which I think sort of justify thinking about this as something fundamental to help the whole of economy transformation rather than just another reporting obligation. But when we think about the reporting side of it, I just go back again to the fact that we very much see transition plans as being integrated with and building from climate disclosure under TCFD and going forward ISSB. And that's the way that we're thinking about it from a regulatory standpoint at the FCA. Within our existing climate disclosure rules for listed companies and asset managers and asset owners, we are explicitly referring to existing TCFD guidance on transition plans. So transition plans are already sort of captured in the TCFD recommendations, and therefore there is already an expectation that companies and those financial services firms in scope of our TCFD-aligned disclosure rules will be delivering on transition plans. What we're then saying is that as we reorient away from TCFD towards ISSB-aligned disclosure requirements in the future, and that will, we expect to be consulting on that once the ISSB standards have been through a government-led endorsement process in the UK. As we do that, we would also expect to be strengthening our expectations around transition plan disclosures by also pointing to what by then would be finalised TPT guidance. So there is a direction of travel towards consultation on ISSB and TPT as a complementary package, and that would be our vehicle for sort of embedding these expectations within our regulatory framework. I hope that helps.
That's great. I was keen to talk then about the sort of international interoperability, for lack of a better word, in terms of, I guess on this panel we've described let's not call it a UK bias, but a UK expertise in terms of being involved in the TPT. But it's clearly the UK is not the only jurisdiction looking at it, and you talked about several international, multinational groups looking at it too. My colleague wrote this very interesting article the other day that was talking about the EU and the US disagreeing or having, disagreeing, let's use that word, as it relates to the CSDDD, one of the many ESG acronyms. And I just wonder, is there, as various different regulators and different regulatory regimes tackle this, do we get into a problem of different kind of definitional standards, different emphases, making it more complicated for an investor who has a global portfolio, for example?
I mean, let's hope not. As an investor in more than 70 countries, it would be a disaster, I think, if, it's different regulations all over the place. So let's hope that jurisdictions can sort of come together and ensure interoperability. And I hope I don't need to say that word too many times because it's so hard to say, especially if English is not your first language. But anyway, it's become the buzzword in many ways, but it is actually really important. So now I said from an investor point of view, of course, so we can compare and contrast across sectors, irrespective of countries. But even more for companies, because a lot of the international companies will then be required to report or have transition plan under several jurisdictions. And it would be really difficult for them if, they have to have different requirements. So let's hope on the regulatory side, all jurisdictions can agree on one global standard, sort of like ISSB now is. Fingers crossed that's happening on sustainability disclosures.
Happy to come in on that.
Maybe just to say, I think there's a lot of work going on, and Mark, I'm sure can talk more about this, to try and promote that interoperability with the TPTs working with GFANs and with ISSB quite intensively, I believe, to try and promote alignment between them, which is great. On the issue of the EU and the CSDD, how many Ds are there?
3, I think.
3, okay. CSDD. I feel that my feeling is that the EU has in many ways been more ambitious in its approach and a first mover in some ways on climate and beyond climate, on nature as well and other issues. But in some ways, it's been quite hard for the market to deliver and to implement a lot of these requirements. Whereas in the UK, I think there's a lot of emphasis on trying to make this really workable and manageable and help make it more implementable, which I think is also extremely useful. Also on things like the green taxonomy, for example, where I think the UK is innovating to try and make this more manageable for the private sector to actually implement. But the EU does have that right level of ambition, I think, because if I understand correctly, the EU has made 1.5 degree alignment a requirement under the CSDD, which is not true in the UK. So in terms of ambition, I think the EU is going in the right place. Whether we can come up with frameworks that are consistent across all these jurisdictions, hopefully we can. I don't think the EU has been very specific about how transition plans should be implemented, for example. So perhaps the ISSB will provide the standard here that can be adopted globally if it's ambitious enough, So I hope we can get towards that international operability, but I'm sure Mark probably can.
So it's front of mind, to be perfectly honest. I mean, when the TPT was sort of first designing its work program, I guess beginning of last year, that whole question of how this can hook into an international framework was absolutely front of mind, and that's what very much sent us down the path of ensuring alignment with GFANS, as Karen just mentioned, and thinking about how material transition plan related information can effectively hook into existing provisions around transition planning within TCFD today and ISSB going forward. So we very much see that alignment with GFANS and ISSB as being sort of critical drivers of international interoperability in the way in which we're thinking about this. We're then complementing that in a number of ways. So as TPT, we're out there doing a huge amount of international outreach, talking to individual jurisdictions around the world, talking to various different international organizations, be that the Financial Stability Board, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, IOSCO, NGFS, the sort of list goes on, because all of these international organizations are thinking very deeply about transition planning and transition plans and transition finance at the moment, and it's important that we've got that engagement with them and start to build a bit of a consensus around some of the conceptual underpinnings of the TPT and the way we're thinking about the disclosure frameworks within it, the disclosure recommendations within the framework. So I think that's a really important aspect. And then the other is just by virtue of the makeup of the TPT, although it is a UK-sponsored initiative, there are many participants at both the steering group and the delivery group level and across the work streams who have very much an international orientation in their work. For one good example is CDP. And if CDP, as they are planning to do, update their transition plan related questionnaire to reflect the TPT disclosure framework, that automatically pushes out that thinking across the very, very wide network of respondents to CDP's surveys. So that is another really important vehicle, working with internationally oriented NGOs and other organizations that can sort of supplement the work that can be done reasonably at the design and at the regulatory level to ultimately drive a consensus around how to think about these issues.
Okay, one last quick question on the kind of international angle, and that is, everything in ESG these days seems to be divided between Europe and America. Do you see that kind of rupture? Is it relevant here in terms of the very aggressive anti-ESG stance that you seem to see in some parts of America?
I'm probably not the best person to talk about that. Maybe my colleagues.
Do you have a view, Karine?
Probably. I mean, in the whole ESG backlash, I think transition plans will also be sort of part of that discussion and debate. So yeah, wouldn't be surprised.
Okay. Thought I'd ask, as we seem to be writing about that all the time. Let me ask you then perhaps a final question, and then we'll get to some audience questions. And that is, what are some reasonable expectations, or what are your expectations for how this will proceed from here? So we said that this isn't really the year of the transition plan, it's the year of thinking about or talking about the transition plan. At what point do we get to a stage where Karine and other investors can actually have, across their portfolios, many transition plans that they can compare, company by company? Oh, this in my kind of retail portfolio, I see that this company is outperforming that company when it comes to ambition and actually decarbonization. We kind of need that information quite quickly, I would guess, given what's happening with the climate. But tell me, what do you think? Perhaps each of you could say what your expectations are, if you dare.
I can start. So I think originally when the government set this up, the expectation was companies would be publishing these by the end of this year. I don't know how realistic that is at this point. Maybe, well, we've heard that not 100% companies are yet doing that, and we're only still in the process of finalising or even working on the guidance at the moment. So it's a bit understandable perhaps if not everyone has got a transition plan in place yet. But I think the expectation and hope is that pretty quickly we will see most companies, all companies that are eligible under this, requirement, to be publishing them. It's currently on a comply or explain basis, but hopefully, the expectation in the market will make it quite difficult for companies not to publish one and to have to explain why they haven't when everyone else is doing it. So hopefully within the next couple of years, we'll have a much higher coverage of transition plans. They may not be the best quality yet, but at least it would provide a basis from which improvement and, progress and evolution can be built. So, yeah, I'm optimistic that we're making quite good progress. I think companies are putting a lot of effort into that, you can see.
Yeah, I agree with that. If you think about also, the increase we've seen in target setting, even though it's not perfect. I mean, if you think about 5 years ago, people didn't talk about net zero 2050 almost for companies, right? So I think we're going to see a huge change and a lot more transition plans from companies within, let's say, the next 2 years. I think in 2025 it will look very different.
Yeah, I fully agree. So if we think about what will be required of listed companies under our rules framework, I've already mentioned that there is already an expectation that transition plan related information will be provided in the context of TCFD reporting. Late last year, we issued a primary markets bulletin to listed companies that encouraged them to already start engaging with the draft materials that at that stage had been published by the TPT. So as you are thinking about your transition plan related disclosure requirements under TCFD, have a look at this emerging guidance. It will help you think through the issues and start you on your journey if you haven't already begun. We will be setting out a direction of travel very soon in terms of implementation of ISSB and TPT as a complementary package, as I was mentioning before, and we'll reiterate the call to listed companies to engage early before it becomes a mandatory requirement, because ultimately this is going to be really useful for them as well as their investors. So we are hoping that there will be more voluntary take-up of the detail of the TPT disclosure framework before it even becomes a mandatory requirement. And then, as I said before, the direction of travel will be to consult once the endorsement process for ISSB has concluded on ISSB implementation for listed companies combined with a reference to TPT as a source of additional detail and granularity around how to engage with the transition planning piece of that. So this should mean that by the time we fast forward a couple of years, you should be seeing much better, not only much better coverage, but also higher quality and greater detail and richness in transition plan disclosures.
So 2025, you're the transition plan. Okay, well, let's open the floor to some questions. Oh, we've got lots on this side. So gentleman with the mic's going to come around, would you say your name and your question? So might as well go to the lady first.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I'm Nikki. I'm from Friends of the Earth, the Netherlands, and we're an NGO that asks credible transition plans from 30 companies in the Netherlands and outside, of which 10 financial institutions. We've talked a lot about what credible transition plans are for real economy companies, but less so what it is for financial institutions. I assume a big part of this would also be their emission reduction targets. Often, I think, people talk about only intensity targets, and I was wondering how you feel about absolute reduction targets also for financial institutions. Thank you.
I'd say that.
Yeah, I can kick off. Thanks very much for the question. So ultimately, what we've been developing at TPT is a sector-neutral framework in the first instance, but there is work underway to elaborate sector-specific guidance. I think there is a very strong recognition that for financial services firms, this is equally a really important vehicle, and GFANTs have already done a lot of thinking about this across the various different alliances that sit under the GFANTs umbrella and are already providing quite a lot of sort of granularity for each of the different segments of the financial services sector. And that guidance will be very relevant and an important input to the continued work that the Transition Plan Taskforce is doing to elaborate at the sector level to make sure that the framework can be applied effectively across the various different parts of the economy and financial services sector.
Next question. We have a gentleman at the front who had a question.
Here.
Sorry, at the back.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Alice. I'm a second-year PhD student, and my topic is related to the ESG criteria. When I first started my PhD, my question was very close to what you were discussing now in this session. So how can we reach harmonization for corporate transitions? However, I must say that I'm halfway through it. And during the process, I started questioning this assumption. And now explain what. ESG does not indicate many different indicators. So one thing is talking about emissions, another is focusing on other indicators like worker conditions. And regarding that, because also many different, we have different conception of what a responsible business is among countries worldwide, I started questioning not only how is it possible to have harmonization, but also if we needed to have a real substantial corporate transition, because having one standardized would mean not taking into account many different types of responsible businesses around the globe, and that would mean not only neglecting part of it, but also maybe hinder some of it to really transition. So this is a reflection that I wanted to bring into the table, because I thought it would be interesting to question for not the first time, but from what I understood here in these sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any reflections on that?
I could come in on that. Yeah, thank you. So I think we do need some harmonisation of metrics to facilitate comparison across the board, both for climate and for nature, and that's even more difficult for nature. But I think the way to handle the issue that I believe you're raising is through appropriate benchmarking and clear pathways that companies in different sectors and possibly different countries are expected to align to, that takes account of the different circumstances that they are operating within. So for net zero, we do have very clear sectoral pathways and national level pathways for many countries that companies can show how closely aligned they are. So you've got the same metrics, you just have a different expected level of alignment or ambition, whatever you want to call it, to align with that pathway. This is what we're working on in relation to nature, actually, because for nature it's much harder. It's a more localized issue. There's multiple metrics you can use. So that's a work in progress, and we're developing a pathway for the UK, a nature positive pathway, to illustrate how it might be done for nature. But for carbon, I think we're almost there. We have a lot of the architecture we need to facilitate that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. But I just wanted to come back to the Friends of the Earth ladies' question as well. Totally agree, we need absolute targets, not just intensity targets. And we recommend SBTI alignment, so Science-Based Targets Initiative aligned targets to be set. The challenge with that is if every company in the world asked SBTI to endorse them, then that would be too much for SBTI to do by itself. So we need an ecosystem around credible science-based target setting so that companies globally can start to do that realistically in a quick time frame. So, yeah. I think it has emissions reduction targets as well. Absolutely.
I'm glad you got to talk about nature because you didn't get to that on the panel. So you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Anthony Hobley, Senior Strategic Advisor to the Inevitable Policy Response, former CEO at Carbon Tracker and former Executive Director of the Mission Possible Partnership. And it's that work this is really resonating off the back of that work we did as the Mission Possible Partnership, where we did those 7 industrial pathways and particularly set out those milestones for those sectors for 2025, 2030, 2035, at least at a global level. So the steel, for example, we have to go from the 1 pilot green steel plant at Hybrid to 100 commercial scale green steel plants producing 280 million tons of green steel by 2030. That rises to 250 by 2035, to 300 to nearly 400 by 2040, etc. And it's similar across all the sectors. And I think the thing we understood from that is decarbonization is very much a team sport. No one steel company, shipping company, or whatever could do this on their own. So when they come to develop these transition plans at a company level, I think a lot of them are going, we're in a vacuum. We don't have the frameworks and the pathways, and you touched on this with the ecosystem. We tried to raise the money to drop those down at a granular level, at least for the major economies. It's about 50 million to sort of do that. And it's not just running models. That's actually probably spending a lot of time in rooms with the companies, the experts, the policymakers, and everyone is involved in understanding the cross relationships between sectors. And to the point about the SBTI targets, it's good, but almost none of those are the producers at the producing end of the value chain. They're almost most of those are at the consumer end. There's very few steel companies, shipping companies, etc. People actually digging stuff out of the ground have taken those targets. So how do we build that ecosystem, those critical frameworks that actually allow companies to produce credible transition plans as a team sport, recognizing they're going to have to collaborate with the competitors, with other sectors, with governments, with other countries? How do we fast track that process? Because we don't have time.
No, I'll kick off. You raise a fantastic and pretty fundamental point. At the end of the day, the first step is, I believe, recognizing is providing a framework that helps an individual entity think through the dependencies, the assumptions they need to make, and who they need to engage with in order to make progress. So the framework that we're setting out has hooks for all of that, and having that pillar that is about engagement strategy, making you think through who in your value chain will you need to engage with in order to make progress on your plan, and how do you prioritize that engagement? How do you go about it? That's a first step. And then if the structures to do that don't exist in the industry in which they, or sort of not just the value chain, but the industry level as well, if the structures don't exist that enable them to do that, that at least forces them to ask the question, how do I do this? How can I reach out? How can I work with the relevant trade association that I'm part of to try to build some of these relationships? And if it requires action at the government level, who do I need to engage in the public sector? How do I undertake my advocacy to try to fast-track progress where it needs to take place? I think a framework that raises the question for at the entity level in the first instance is the critical first step. And then you're absolutely right, this is a team sport, and we absolutely need whole of economy collaboration, involving collaboration between public and private sector and within different parts of each of those segments, and internationally as well.
Okay, another question over here.
Josh Williams at File. So what do you think would be an appropriate response to when a company abandons its transition plans? Because I've just seen very recently BP and Shell had transition plans and they've abandoned it and the share price went up. So what do we think, how should we respond to when that happens?
I think, so the question was, what do we do if a company sort of don't abandon their transition plans? Sorry, did I get that right?
No, they do abandon. So they go back, they abandon their transition plans. So BP and Shell had transition plans, which they've now gone back on.
If they walk away from it.
Yeah.
Backtracking from their commitments.
So what do we do as an investor then? Yeah. First of all, we try to engage with the company, talk to the company. Why do they do that? What's the obstacles? What's going on? Trying to understand the situation. Is there something externally? Is there something within the company? So what's driving that? And I think then we having, based on that understanding of why it's happening, I think at least as an investor, we then have to think sort of either one or two ways. Will we continue to be an investor and sort of support the companies in getting back on track again and push the company back on track again? Or do we think sort of in the end, this company does not have a viable then business in the longer term, and we don't think we want to be an owner in that company, and we will then, we may then choose to divest. But I think for us very much is trying to understand the circumstances, trying to understand the situation the company is in, and seeing if, the plan maybe was difficult to implement today, maybe it's possible to get the company back on track, in a year or two. So at least we'll try to think, longer term than just, as what's happening here and now.
Maybe if I can come in on that as well, I think it's a really good question, because I think the challenge is that if they're doing that, it's probably because they can make much more money by abandoning it. And so how many investors are really going to say, oh no, we don't want you to do that, we're going to disinvest? Maybe the most progressive will, but probably most won't. So I think that is a fundamental challenge to this theory of change, that we rely on the market, and that you therefore need either regulators to be enforcing alignment and implementation of the plan and the level of ambition, and that they're not currently asked to do that, but that is going to be required, I believe, going forward. I welcome your thoughts on that, Mark, as well. But also policy to make it less profitable, to prevent that from happening in some way. And there's many different levers that could be used, but at the moment not being used adequately, as we've all seen. So I think we can't just rely on transition plans and disclosure and the markets to sort of govern this transition, for sure.
Just super quickly, I think this goes back to the earlier point that we were discussing around the complementarity between government action, regulatory action and investor action. At the moment, because there is not a sort of clear, thou shalt have a 1.5 degree aligned plan and stick to it, sort of coming from the public policy level, you're reliant then on the disclosure of what companies are actually doing and the plans that they have and the extent to which they are committing to them, and then investor action to hold the companies to account. And so you ideally need all three pieces working together: the government, the regulatory framework, and the investor action. But fundamentally, you also probably need a mindset shift across the whole financial services sector. You need a mindset shift that lengthens horizons, that prices externalities more effectively in valuation, that ultimately incentivizes individual allocators of capital, individual portfolio managers, to not think about where they're going to be in their performance rankings next quarter, because staying with Shell as the price rises is going to put them higher in those performance rankings than if they sort of ride it out and invest for the long term. So you've got lots of different norms within the way in which the financial services sector operates and the way in which decisions are taken that ultimately may need to be shifted in order to fully align with a net zero future.
Yeah, a lot of change. Got a question here, and we've got a question here. We had a gentleman here. Quite a few questions still.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Paris Jordan from Waverton Investment Management and co-founder of a DFM ESG network, VirtuVest. Sorry, Mark, horrible question for you now, as probably expected from me. You just mentioned about the three pillars there, so government, companies, and then regulation. Now, I think there's hopefully many of you agree that actually government enforcement or government initiative in terms of net zero or even transition has been pretty poor. What influence or interactions are the regulators of the FCA specifically having with government to kind of put pressure on them to do more? Is it something that you don't really have much control over either? Or is there anything that I guess us as investors can do as well? I think other than, voting in general that we do in our own personal lives, fine. But how can we effectively get government to do more?
So, as you might imagine, I can only go so far in my response to that question. But what I would say is that there is a lot of cross-official sector engagement on all of these issues. Most recently, we all collaborated towards the refresh of the government's green finance strategy, as published at the end of March. So there is a lot that happens within that within that sphere, but there's obviously a limit to what one can do in that sense, and ultimately, I think, going back to my response to one of the earlier questions around the engagement pillar, that sort of macro stewardship piece, that engagement with official sector is absolutely critical here. I think if investors feel that there are constraints to what they can do because of the legal framework in which they operate, there is a really strong opportunity to voice that and engage actively with those decision makers.
Just to add to that, there is a sort of discussion about whether in transition plans a key part of it should be the company saying what policies would help it to move further or faster. And then that is a weight of evidence building all the time about what the private sector needs the government to do to deliver that net zero transition, which hopefully, turns on its head possible past lobbying practices where companies have lobbied government not to do climate policy and instead makes the private sector much more pro-government policy and with a long-term impact on government's incentives to actually respond, because the private sector is obviously a powerful influence on the government. So hopefully that can be part of the way transition plans really help to drive faster progress going forward.
Can I just pick up on that point? I mean, I think that is absolutely right. We have within the TPT framework a disclosure recommendation around assumptions and dependencies. And personally, I think that is one of the most powerful parts of the framework, because we are dealing here with plans that are going to be extending over a very long horizon, and for investors, clarity around where there is uncertainty, where there are critical dependencies, and what assumptions are therefore being made in the face of that uncertainty is absolutely crucial. And it will be policy uncertainty, technology uncertainty. It'll be assumptions around what's happening in other regions and jurisdictions. So all of that can be incredibly powerful information for investors, but also, as Karen's saying, a really important input to how a company then prioritizes its engagement with value chain, other parts of the industry, and with government.
Fantastic. We've got about 5 minutes left. Who else wanted to ask a question?
Yes, hello. Peter Webb. I'm a visiting researcher at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. My question is, when we're talking about a net zero transition plan, you've got direct carbon, which is relatively straightforward, you've got indirect carbon produced, and then you've got the scope 3. So my question's around the scope 3. What's the current thinking about whether this should be entirely in scope, thought about, how should it be counted? You can have huge discussions about what a scope 3 emission envelope looks like. So just a few thoughts on scope 3, please.
I'll kick off with what we're saying in the Transition Plan Taskforce disclosure framework. It is a recommended disclosure within the TPT framework, and a disclosure to a recommendation to disclose scope 3 emissions reduction targets, and then on an ongoing basis progress against those. But also to be very, very clear whether there are any categories that are emitted from both either your target or your ongoing calculation. But there is ultimately a very clear steer there that this is going to be important decision useful information to form part of your disclosures, and any assumptions that you are making or any emissions from your calculation should be fully transparent, along with an explanation as to why they're emitted and how you might expect to improve your disclosure going forward. I think overarching all of this, because there are huge challenges with scope 3 as there are with many other aspects of this, with all of this, I think there has to be a recognition that this is a journey, and that the quality and comprehensiveness and indeed the consistency and comparability of plans will improve incrementally over time. So it's not going to be perfect from the get-go, and I think that is sort of generally understood. But as we see the first plans against the framework emerging, that will also expose where more work needs to be done within the wider ecosystem to help preparers improve their plans going forward. So this is going to be an iterative process, it's going to be a dynamic process, but again, it comes back to this point that we need an ecosystem to build around this if this is going to be done effectively.
Great.
No, I can just add for us, when we talk about target setting, it also includes material scope 3 emissions. And then you ask what's material, and we say the way that's up to the company to explain, is it material or not?
Excellent. Next question.
Michelle Horsfield, a Japanese bank called SMBC. We have developed a series of questions evaluating a transition plan. Are we foolish to try and score them?
Good question.
Are we foolish to try and score?
Are we foolish to try and score a transition plan?
You'd be like score 0 to 10, whether it's good, bad, okay. If we should, okay.
Maybe I'll just start. I think we need, as I was saying earlier, we do need to be able to compare them and maybe rank them in a sector, in a country. We've got to take the context into account. So I do think we need to get to that place. Bit nervous to do it just yet because it's very early days. Lots of companies haven't got them. We don't want to disincentivize companies from trying hard with their first one and getting their first attempt out there either. We want to speed up progress. We don't want to apply judgment too strictly too soon. Let's give it a little bit of time for what good looks like to become slightly clearer, but we do definitely need to get to a place where we can then compare and use that as pressure to improve performance and drive a race to the top. So yeah, in due course, I would say.
At the end of the day, there has to be a basis to form a judgment. And that may, within an individual firm, take the form of a score or a ranking. But ultimately, I think the critical part of that is an assessment framework that will help the firm make a judgment and make decisions off of the back of the plans. After all, that is what they are there for. The form it takes, I think, is ultimately up to individual users of the information. But the plan on its own is not going to drive change unless the users of that information have a basis to push it into their investment decision-making processes, and that will be some form of assessment.
Fantastic. We've got time just for one final question before lunch, and this gentleman here.
Yeah, hi. It's Riccardo Sallusti from Lewis in Rome. I've been involved in discussion with EFRAG on one specific issue, which was the opportunities disclosure within the strategy element of a transition plan. What is clear is that a lot of corporates are not going to be keen necessarily, because of business secrecy, to disclose exactly how they intend to, let's say, identify at a more detailed level opportunities and understand exactly what is the intention and the willingness of the investor to understand exactly that bit. And if you look at the ISSB, the wording there is a bit blurry. So the issue really is, how can we, I'm not sure where you're going to have the answer, by the way, how can you really coordinate the need of investors to understand the opportunities and the ability of a corporate to pursue that opportunity effectively and comparing that with competitors, and at the same time, the need of entrepreneurs to keep the good ideas for themselves?
Yeah, I don't think I have the answer to that, but I think you're pointing out something very important when we talk about climate change risk, is that we focus on, or climate change, we focus so much on risk and maybe not enough on opportunities. And if you think about the amount of money that needs to go into sort of the green side in the next few years, it's huge amounts, it's huge opportunities there. So yes, I mean, the definitely transition plan should also capture the opportunities in some way or forms, although the details of that, I'm not really sure how that's captured in the TPD framework.
It's there. It's absolutely there, and the whole conceptual underpinning of the framework is very much aligned with the way that ISSB thinks about both risks and opportunities. But I think your point, if I understood it correctly, is really about the reticence of a preparer to reveal too much due to commercial sensitivity. Is that? Yeah. And I think that is just something that's going to evolve. I mean, we are talking here about, well, with sustainability-related disclosures broadly, we are in a much more forward-looking world. And ultimately, we do not yet have the corporate reporting norms around how to navigate things like commercial sensitivity and how to navigate the natural reticence to put down on paper something that you might be uncertain about. I think capabilities will build in that space, and we will start to see norms emerging. But you raise a very, very important point. It is a matter that the community at large is going to need to work through if that information is going to be truly decision useful, because you cannot fail to have the opportunity part of the equation out there in the public domain if investors like Corinne are going to make informed decisions off the back of it. So you raise a really good point. I don't have a great answer at this point, but it is going to definitely be an area that will need to evolve.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sorry for those questions that we didn't get to answer, but please do come and bombard the panelists afterwards. Before we thank them, I just wanted to say one quick announcement about lunch. And that's to say that there's some dining tickets are now available for purchase if you wish to do that, and you can do it by seeing Patricia at the reception downstairs. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation.